You're watching Season 7. HBO just didn't want to pay for it. Season 6, the final act of The Sopranos, and arguably its most chaotic masterpiece. On paper, it's a single season. In reality, it's two in a trench coat, pretending to be one. Nearly double the length of its predecessors, it aired in two distinct parts, separated by a year-long hiatus, all thanks to some HBO contract gymnastics. Officially, it was Season 6A and 6B. Unofficially, it was a budgetary sleight of hand meant to sidestep salary renegotiations by avoiding the dreaded 7th season label. Because nothing says prestige television like corporate penny pinching, masquerading as creative structure. Even the cast wasn't buying the charade. Several of them refer to these as Seasons 6 and 7, and frankly, they're right to do so. They were filmed a year apart, they feel like separate seasons, and anyone still pretending otherwise deserves to be put under house arrest, with only AJ's existential monologues for company. Speaking of AJ, his hair seems to undergo its own subplot, defying continuity in a way that would make even the most forgiving viewer wince. Short, then long, then short again, as if the character is trying on identities in between haircuts. Yes, hair grows. Yes, barbers exist. But when a show goes full Shakespearean tragedy, perhaps we can expect the wigs department to show up on time. Still, if the timeline's jagged, the storytelling certainly isn't. Season 6 is a triumph of dissent. Tony, the anti-hero who once danced around morality with operatic finesse, finally reaches rock bottom and starts digging. While Seasons 4 and 5 flirted with darkness, Season 6 dives in and gets comfortable. It's unflinching, brutal, and nihilistic, exactly the tonal shift a show like this needed before slamming the door shut. And then there's the quote, "What you don't know could fill a book." One of the show's best. A line so razor-sharp it doubles as both insult and philosophy. Misunderstood by many, misused by most, but as elegant as anything David Chase ever wrote. It serves as a fitting epigraph to a season defined by characters finally confronting just how little they understand about the world, each other, and themselves. In short, whether you call it 6A and 6B, or just concede it's Seasons 6 and 7 in drag, this final stretch of The Sopranos doesn't just stick the landing, it plants a flag. The show collapses into itself in a slow, operatic implosion, and that, in the annals of television, is nothing short of heroic. Everyone praises the violence, but it's the words that killed first in The Sopranos. In The Sopranos, words don't just hurt, they detonate. The series is a symphony of ill-timed, ill-advised, and utterly tone-deaf statements, each delivered with surgical recklessness, often in moments already teetering on the edge of violence or betrayal. It's a testament to the show's writing that dialogue often becomes the final push over the cliff. So the question isn't if someone said the wrong thing, it's which verbal landmine was the most catastrophic. Let's begin with Brendan Filone, the world's least essential criminal with the gall of a Shakespearean fool. His now infamous Chemo Sabe quip about Jackie Aprile Sr., delivered while the man was dying of cancer, wasn't just tasteless, it was suicidal. That Brendan managed to walk away from that without being buried under a Pine Barren snowdrift is nothing short of miraculous. His other gem, the sarcastic suggestion that Christopher call Tony so Tony can call Junior just to change the channel, was another reminder that Brendan's wit far outpaced his rank, or his survival instincts. Then there's Ralph Cifaretto, a man whose mouth is a one-man demolition crew. His response to Tracy's death, "Is it my fault she's a klutz?" was sociopathy disguised as smarm. And his feeble attempt to justify the fate of poor Pyomai only added a layer of grotesque narcissism to the character's already gleaming pile of moral rot. Ralph didn't just speak at the wrong time. He weaponized speech, always aiming it at the most vulnerable angle. Some entries achieve a kind of poetic bluntness. Adriana's "Chris, you're in the mafia," for example, was an astounding moment of attempted clarity delivered to a man violently allergic to self-awareness. Of course, Christopher counters with his own tragicomic whimper, "I'll never pass a drug test," the anguished cry of a man who finally glimpses his own implosion. And then there's the heartbreakingly doomed J.T. Dolan, whose fatal miscalculation was trying to reason with a drunk, spiraling Christopher. J.T. wasn't wrong, he was just in the wrong show. A recovering addict, a writer, and most crucially, a civilian, he tried to apply logic and morality to a man entirely stripped of both. And for that, he got a bullet to the head. Of all the poorly timed statements, JT's may be the most tragic, because it came from someone who genuinely thought words could save him. Of course, any discussion of poorly timed remarks would be incomplete without mentioning little Carmine's infamous, "Whatever happened there?" A cryptic koan of accidental genius. Or was it? There's a case to be made that little Carmine is far shrewder than the show lets on. His penchant for malapropisms and mixed metaphors masks a man who may understand, far better than his counterparts, how to survive a world built on perception. One wonders if, in the grand scheme, it's little Carmine, not Butch, who emerges as the true tactician. After all, the sacred and the profane do occasionally intersect. A few honorable mentions deserve nods for sheer absurdity. The waiter in the parking lot, whose polite inquiry, "Excuse me, gentlemen, was there a problem with the service?" earned him a death sentence. Georgie, whose every utterance in Tony's presence functioned as an invitation to be physically assaulted. And of course, the immortal nihilistic shrug from Tony himself. "I beat cancer, but it took him out." Cold, detached, and brutal, a perfect summation of the show's moral landscape. But if there must be a crown jewel of catastrophic commentary, it still belongs to "Whatever Happened There?" Delivered with the innocence of a man describing spilled milk, it managed to distill a violent, intricate power play into 6 words of sublime confusion. Intentional or not, it remains the show's most oddly brilliant line, proof that sometimes the dumbest thing said is actually the smartest. So who wins? The real mastermind? The most tragically mistimed speaker? Perhaps the answer is in that final, glib bit of advice. That's why you gotta live for today. Because tomorrow, someone might open their mouth and end up dead in a parking lot. The Sopranos wanted gritty realism, but instead gave us strippers grinding to funeral music. In The Sopranos, the Bada Bing was never just a strip club. It doubled as Tony's office, a mobster's sanctuary, and apparently, a place where musical logic went to die. For a show so obsessed with curating the perfect soundtrack, it's almost poetic how utterly bizarre the Bing's musical choices often were. Less erotic energy, more existential crisis set to classic rock. Take, for example, the inspired decision to have the dancers perform to The Doors when the music's over. An 11-minute psychedelic spiral complete with Morrison's signature organ-induced nervous breakdowns. Ideal for evoking dread, confusion, maybe a light acid trip, but titillation? Not so much. One can only assume the girls were told, just writhe vaguely and hope for the best. And this wasn't an isolated lapse. Living on a thin line by the Kinks, melancholic, haunting, and oddly compelling, also made an appearance. A great song, certainly, but its placement in a strip club feels like forcing a eulogy to do the work of a lap dance. It's the kind of track that makes you contemplate the decline of Western civilization, not reach for singles. Session by Linkin Park also turned up, adding to the parade of tonal whiplash. A moody instrumental piece with all the energy of someone reflecting on their own funeral, because nothing says seduction like nu metal ambience and ambient dread. At this point, it starts to feel deliberate, as if the editors had a bet on how many patrons they could emotionally destabilize in a single montage. Of course, the crown jewel in this gallery of musical dissonance remains, evidently Chickentown, playing during Tracy's tragic episode. As the poet John Cooper Clarke hurls his bleak, rhythmic invectives, "There's no England now," we're treated to the sight of pole dancers grinding to pure nihilism. One imagines Ginny Sack doing a half-hearted shimmy in the background as the British class system collapses via spoken word. To be fair, this wasn't entirely the stripper's fault. According to actor Steve Sharippa, the scenes were filmed without music and scored in post-production. That explains the offbeat moves, less bump and grind, more interpretive chaos. But it raises the question, who, in post, decided these dancers needed to emote to an acid-fueled funeral dirge instead of, say, something remotely erotic? The truth is, in a show that prided itself on diegetic sound, the Bing's musical misfires were less mistakes and more sacrificial lambs. The showrunners wanted realism, and in the process, turned every strip scene into a tragicomic ballet of mismatched intention. The dancers wanted hip-hop, they got Metallica. They wanted club hits, they got the Kinks. One wonders if Silvio, ever the loyal consigliere, was secretly curating the playlist to mirror Tony's slow descent. If his subconscious bled through in song choice, like a DJ channeling existential rot through the club speakers. In the end, the Bada Bing wasn't about titillation. It was about dissonance between appearance and reality, power and decay, beat and body. And nowhere was that more painfully, hilariously clear than in the music. Vito Spataphor didn't die because he was gay. He died because he was weak. Of all the morally bankrupt, emotionally constipated men in The Sopranos, Vito Spataphor somehow managed to stand out. And not for any noble reason. His story wasn't the most violent, nor was it the most ambitious. It was simply the most pathetic. He had more avenues to save himself than most, and yet he chose the most self-defeating path available. A man boxed in on all sides, yes, but largely by his own indecision and weak grasp of reality. Let's not pretend Vito's situation was simple. Once outed as gay, or, in the show's less forgiving parlance, a fanook, he faced the immutable code of the mob: live in hiding or die by their hand. Returning to his family in Jersey meant certain death. Staying with his lover Jim in New Hampshire meant a permanent exile from his children and his identity as a made man. Either way, part of him had to die. But instead of choosing to let his ego perish, he opted to gamble with his actual life. He had options, plenty of them. He could have vanished for good, resurfaced under a new name in the Midwest, maybe convinced Marie to relocate with the kids. She only asked for $100,000 from Tony, and Vito was a top earner. There were stashes of cash, $30,000 just lying around his house. He could have reinvented himself. Others have started new lives with far less. But no. Vito tried one day of honest labor and wilted. The man couldn't survive without the illusion of power that came with being a mafioso. He wasn't addicted to money or family. He was addicted to the identity that gave him control. Then there's the truly baffling part. Instead of disappearing quietly or even attempting to deny the rumors, he fled. And in doing so, confirmed everything. Tony, ever pragmatic, might have even believed him if he'd tried to lie. But flight sealed his fate. Worse still, he had the chance to neutralize the problem early. If he had any real sense of self-preservation, those two guys who saw him at the gay bar would never have left it breathing. A staged confrontation, a barroom brawl, a few threats to the bartender, it would have bought him time. Instead, he let them leave and make the call that doomed him. Once again, Vito chose passivity, and once again, it killed him. Silvio once said Vito was quiet. Vito was about as quiet as a Hoover on a hardwood floor. He was sloppy, reckless, and oblivious to the lethal reality he inhabited. He frequented a mob-connected gay bar. He engaged in sex acts at his construction job. If he'd truly grasped the danger, he wouldn't have dared set foot back in Jersey. he certainly wouldn't have been strutting around thinking he could slot right back into the crew. It's laughable in hindsight. A man like Vito, with so many ways out, drove straight into his own execution, because folding napkins in New Hampshire made him feel small. Even in death, he leaves a trail of what-ifs. If he'd just stayed gone a few more years, he could have returned to an emptied-out Jersey, with Phil dead or in prison, and Tony no longer caring. But Vito wasn't just delusional, he was a creep. His murder of that innocent man on the rural road wasn't the act of a cornered man. It was a flash of his core self, desperate, ruthless, and devoid of conscience. Gay or not, Vito Spataphor was one of the vilest characters on the show, not because of his sexuality, but because of his cowardice, cruelty, and absolute refusal to choose anything over his pride. Tony said it best. Why couldn't he just stay wherever the hell he was? Because Vito didn't want survival. He wanted status. And he died not as a martyr of mob intolerance, but as a casualty of his own delusion. Tony Soprano didn't ruin David Scatino's life. David Scatino did. You told me not to get in the game. Why'd you let me do it? David Scatino's whimpering deflection, delivered from the floor of his own sporting goods store turned makeshift campsite, is the final whimper of a man who refuses to take ownership of a life he's driven straight into a ditch. Even in the throes of financial ruin, Scatino's first instinct is to shift blame to Tony, of all people, who explicitly warned him not to sit at the table. This, in a nutshell, is David Scatino. Not just a degenerate gambler, but a man who treats personal responsibility like a blackjack dealer treats a losing hand, swept away and forgotten. He is, without question, one of the Sopranos' least sympathetic figures. Every choice he makes is pathetic, every excuse grating, and watching his downward spiral unfold is less tragic than it is infuriating. Scatino isn't just weak, he's actively deceptive. His final, fatal misstep is lying to Christopher, claiming Tony fronted him the last few payments while Tony was asleep. That move didn't just insult Tony's intelligence, it triggered the one thing Soprano won't abide, being played for a fool. Tony, notably, tried to talk him out of joining the game several times. Against better judgment, he let him in, and David, already $8,000 in the hole to Richie Aprile, plunged in anyway. The result? A predictable financial implosion and a broken man camped out in a store he can no longer afford. But of course, this is The Sopranos, and no downfall comes without a touch of dramatic irony. Artie Bucco, ever the earnest idealist, is heartbroken he can't help his old friend. Alas, he's got more pressing obligations, like putting a new roof on the restaurant. The line sounds almost comical in its banality, but it serves as a tidy metaphor. Everyone's trying to patch the holes in their own lives, and David's storm is his to weather. In the end, Scatino is a walking allegory, a frog riding the back of the scorpion, pleading for safety, only to be stung midstream. Because that's his nature. His fall doesn't just illustrate addiction or desperation, it highlights the rigid duality of Tony's world. There's the friend side, full of nostalgia and misplaced sentiment, and then there's the business side, where loyalty ends and consequences begin. And Tony? At worst, he gets a free dinner out of the arrangement. At best, he learns, again, what happens when he blurs those two worlds. David Scatino's story arc is powerful because it's so bleakly unexceptional. He's not a villain. He's not a tragic hero. He's just a man who bet everything on the hope that he could beat the system, then sobbed when it crushed him. This one stupid punch destroyed Tony Blundetto's entire future, and no one talks about it. Tony Blundetto didn't just burn a bridge when he assaulted Mr. Kim. He launched a grenade at his own exit route from organized crime. The moment he lashed out, fists first, at the one man who had actually given him a legitimate second chance, Blundetto effectively signed the death warrant on his so-called straight life. Let's be clear, there was no justification for the attack. None. Mr. Kim, the dry cleaning entrepreneur with an unfortunate knack for dealing with ex-con egomaniacs, was not some cartoon villain out to crush Tony B's spirit. Quite the opposite. Mr. Kim was skeptical, understandably so, but ultimately stuck his neck out to offer Blundetto a real opportunity. All Tony B had to do was follow through. But that would require consistency, humility, and a basic grasp of delayed gratification. 3 things Tony B seemed tragically allergic to. In a show filled with moral grays, Mr. Kim stands out as an anomaly. A relatively decent man in a world designed to punish decency. His reward? Getting pummeled by a man-child with a grudge against the mirror. Kim's initial wariness about hiring an ex-con wasn't unfounded. It was prophetic. And what happens if Mr. Kim had fought back? Say he managed to turn the tables and put Blundetto in the ER. Would he be clipped for his trouble? Unlikely. Mr. Kim wasn't exactly wading deep in mob waters. But he also wasn't free to call the police without consequence. The fact that he had any kind of business entanglement with Tony Soprano, unions, favors, whatever murky deal that was, meant that going to the authorities would come with a subtle, possibly violent reminder to stay quiet. After all, the Soprano brand of justice doesn't run through the court system. It prefers backrooms, body bags, and plausible deniability. Still, even without police involvement, that punch was the turning point. Blundetto didn't just lose a job. He obliterated the last sliver of a path to normalcy. From that moment on, he wasn't pretending to go straight anymore. He was back in. All in. The hit on Joey Peeps wasn't a shocking pivot. It was a natural consequence of a man who had already decided he couldn't live without chaos. The spiral was inevitable from there. Peeps, Angelo, Billy Leotardo, one bad choice bleeding into the next. Could things have turned out differently if Tony B had chosen to actually invest the money he found into the business, instead of blowing it on designer threads and delusions of grandeur? Sure. But again, that would have required forethought, not fantasy. He had access to the Don of New Jersey himself, a casino job lined up that could have made him a very comfortable living. And he still chose the one hit that triggered a cascade of bodies, and eventually, his own death. But perhaps the most honest thing the Sopranos ever did was to never pretend Tony Blundetto was some misunderstood hero. He wasn't. He was impulsive, selfish, and ungrateful. He didn't need a noble reason to hit Mr. Kim. He did it because he couldn't stand being reminded, by a 57-year-old Korean businessman no less, that flying straight requires more than lip service. It requires discipline, which Blundetto clearly mistook for oppression. In the world of The Sopranos, no good deed goes unpunished, and Mr. Kim learned that lesson the hard way. As for Blundetto, his outburst wasn't just unjustified, it was stupid. The tragic kind of stupid. Because in choosing violence over growth, he didn't just throw away a job. He threw away the only version of himself that could have survived. Daniel Baldwin destroyed AJ Soprano's relationship, and no one talks about it. Blanca was gone the moment AJ brought her to the Cleaver premiere. Not emotionally, not physically, existentially. It was the kind of implosion only a Baldwin could trigger. And in this case, it was the 4th most illustrious of the clan, Daniel Baldwin, delivering the cinematic death blow with the immortal line, "What you need is a man." Blanca, instantly entranced by a C-list actor in a D-list film, watched her boyfriend fade into irrelevance mid-scene. AJ's fate was sealed not by infidelity or incompatibility, but by a poorly lit horror flick and a Baldwin brother in full tragicomic flight. Let's not pretend AJ ever had a fighting chance. He might know the proper posture for a knife fight, but emotional resilience? Nowhere to be found. This is the same boy who almost drowned in a swimming pool, not from injury, but from sheer existential angst. The same boy who, in front of his girlfriend, whined to his mother about his outfit like a child forced into church clothes. No Baldwin, Daniel, Billy, or even Stephen, who reportedly schooled F. Murray Abraham in the art of performance, could teach AJ how to inhabit the role of man convincingly. And that's what Blanca needed. Not a boy with access to power, but a man with presence, a commodity AJ never had in stock. The breakup wasn't spontaneous. Blanca had one foot out the door long before AJ knelt down in a pathetic attempt at permanence. The proposal only confirmed what she already knew. AJ was a boy masquerading in Mafia heir's clothing, and she wasn't staying for the costume party. Her decision was final, brutal, and entirely deserved. Could she have been a bit reckless, letting a Baldwin's campy line tip the scales? Possibly. But then again, Blanca never struck one as particularly interested in stability. She wasn't about to let the supposed dawn-in-waiting of New Jersey weigh her down, especially not one who cried on command, and not in a good way. There simply aren't enough Gary Fishers in the world to barter AJ's neuroses into strength. He was weak. He is weak. End of story. And no amount of screen time, family prestige, or Sopranos lore can redeem that. Let's move on. Ralphie wasn't killed for the horse. That was just the excuse. In the twisted meritocracy of The Sopranos, there's one unspoken law that trumps all others. Money talks, and everything else takes a bullet. Case in point, Ralphie Cifaretto's inexplicable ability to repeatedly insult, undermine, and antagonize Gigi Sestone, a made man and acting captain, without so much as a slap on the wrist. Ralphie wasn't even a captain at the time. So how exactly did he get away with it? Simple. He was the best earner in the crew. The Mafia, like any soulless corporate machine, doesn't run on respect. It runs on revenue. Ralphie, with his golden pipeline from the construction rackets, pulling in an eye-watering $3 million a year, had a kind of diplomatic immunity. He could push buttons, cross lines, and play the role of professional irritant with impunity, because he did what truly mattered. He made money. Gigi may have outranked him on paper, but in Tony Soprano's world, cash flow outweighed command. Yes, Ralphie was insufferable. He broke balls not out of camaraderie, but as a sport. He had no respect for Gigi, and everyone knew it. But because Ralphie was a made man, one who also happened to be indispensable to the family's bottom line, he operated within a system that tolerated, even enabled his venomous antics. The code prohibited Gigi from laying a finger on him without cause approved from the top. Insults, sarcasm, passive-aggressive power plays, all just another day in the office. Gigi, theoretically, could have made Ralphie's life a bureaucratic hell, reassign him, cut his access, isolate him from operations. But even that would require backing. And Tony Soprano had already made his position clear. Loyalty was nice, tradition was fine, but money was sacred. Ralphie understood this perfectly, and he exploited it ruthlessly. Tony's eventual decision to kill Ralphie, ostensibly over a horse, had less to do with financial calculus and more with Tony's signature impulsiveness. That wasn't a clean business call. It was emotional detonation. Ironically, one of the few times Tony actually does act in the interest of the family's long-term stability is when he begrudgingly tries to shield Vito, of all people. But with Ralphie, the dam broke. Not because Ralphie stopped being valuable, but because Tony stopped being able to stomach him. So no, Ralphie didn't outrank Gigi. He out-earned him. And in that world, that's all that matters. Gigi might have fantasized about putting a bullet in him, and eventually, he probably would have. But as long as Ralphie's ledger stayed green, his mouth stayed free. Respect is negotiable. Revenue is not. Everyone says The Sopranos is perfect, but some scenes are straight up unwatchable. And yes, we're naming names. Even the most die-hard fans have their limits. And for The Sopranos, those limits seem to center around some of its most painfully human, unvarnished moments. While the show demands full attention and often rewards it, there are still scenes that test patience, induce cringe, or simply make viewers want to launch the remote across the room. Yes, the fast-forward taboo exists, even in a series practically worshipped for its depth and nuance. Let's start with one scene that seems to spark an almost primal discomfort: Carmela and Rosalie in the hospital. It begins innocently enough, Rosalie offering a dose of maternal wisdom during one of AJ's routine emotional collapses. But Carmela, ever the queen of passive-aggressive cruelty, slices her down mid-sentence. "I'm sorry your son is dead, but I don't want your parental guidance." A line so acidic it leaves a scar. Rosalie, whose loyalty and friendship have been unwavering, becomes collateral damage in Carmela's righteous self-pity. The scene is brilliant, honest, and deeply uncomfortable. Two broken women, clawing through the wreckage of their delusions, trying to parent sons neither of them truly understands. It's raw, it's real, and for many, it's simply too much. Carmela, of course, doesn't stop there. Her talent for weaponizing grief resurfaces later, in Paris no less, where she delivers another signature jab. "You know what you should be thinking about? How your kid got shot in the head outside a housing project in Boonton." Carmela may dress in pearls, but she swings like a gangster. Other scenes prompt less introspection and more outright avoidance. Fran Felstein's off-key warbling of "Happy Birthday?" Fast forward. Her shoe show and tell? Skip. The viewer gets it. Nostalgia meets delusion, and Tony's ego laps it up, but it plays like a deleted scene from a very sad lounge act. The infamous Massive Genius and Visiting Day episodes also take frequent hits. Whether it's the clunky attempts at social commentary or the sheer physical discomfort they induce, they've earned their place in the skip pile. And then there's the Columbus episode, a tonal misfire that feels more like a required viewing assignment from a disgruntled cultural studies professor than a cohesive part of the show. Yes, it includes the spectacularly hilarious "He was gay, Gary Cooper" line, but even diamonds get lost in the rubble. Father Intentola's sleepover with Carmela? Squirm-worthy. Mr. Wegler's ill-fated romance with her? Uncomfortable to the point of second-hand embarrassment. And if anyone made it through the Tony and Gloria zoo date without a sudden craving to leap into the tiger enclosure, congratulations on your emotional fortitude. Some purists claim they never fast-forward. Every scene, no matter how minor or excruciating, supposedly contributes to the grand narrative tapestry. Admirable, if a little performative. As if skipping a few scenes is tantamount to whacking the Pope. But here's the truth. The Sopranos doesn't just ask us to watch. It dares us to sit with the parts we hate. It forces us to squirm through the silences, the cruelty, the awkward sex scenes, and the cringe-inducing breakdowns. It's a show about people who can't change and don't really want to. And sometimes, witnessing that in real time is just too much to bear. So yes, the fast-forward button gets some action. Not because the show fails, but because it succeeds a little too well. The Sopranos prequel wasn't just bad. It was an insult to the entire series. Somewhere in the ever-expanding universe of derivative television, there lies a graveyard of squandered potential, and the Sopranos franchise is perilously close to contributing yet another headstone. For all its cultural gravitas and narrative brilliance, the post-series output has been a curious exercise in aimlessness, culminating in a prequel that, let's not mince words, was as uninspired as it was unnecessary. The solution? Stop tiptoeing around nostalgia and commit to something bolder. Consider Pauly Walnuts Gualtieri, a man so deeply entrenched in the mythology of the DeMeo crime family that he managed to become a caricature of himself in the best possible way. A series chronicling Pauly in his prime, when he was only half a wise guy, a foot soldier clawing for relevance, wouldn't just entertain. It would inject fresh perspective into a franchise that's become too enamored with Tony's navel-gazing and brooding existentialism. Better still, shift the focus entirely. Johnny Boy Soprano. the best earner the DeMeo family ever saw, and the very blueprint of the man Tony became. His story deserves more than scattered flashbacks and mumbled references. With recurring appearances from a younger, deadpan Paulie, the result could offer a panoramic view of the family's rise, through characters who didn't spend every episode in therapy. Of course, such proposals are inevitably met with the dreaded cry of "no more prequels," as if the genre itself is the problem. It's not. The problem is lazy, reverent prequels that try too hard to color inside the lines. What's needed is bold storytelling, not sacred preservation. And if we're dreaming big, why not fully embrace the absurd? A feature-length version of Cleaver, the meta B-movie fever dream briefly glimpsed in the original series, could be a triumph of pulp and parody. Picture it, a supernatural mafia horror film, dripping with gore and mob cliches, existing in a parallel Sopranos universe and winking at its own ridiculousness. No one's asking for The Godfather. Just give it the camp of Grindhouse with the swagger of North Jersey. Alternatively, greenlight Walnuts the movie, a chaotic character study dressed as a farce. Let it chronicle the rise of Paulie, his misadventures with a bodacious young Nucci, and a bingo hall's worth of acid-tongued old women who raised a sociopath with manners. The geriatric antics alone could outshine half of what's on prestige television today. The Sopranos ended, but the world it built doesn't need to. What it does need is vision, something more inventive than retroactive fan service disguised as canon. Enough with the grave tone and sacred cows. It's time to get weird, get funny, and above all, get Paulie. Tony Soprano didn't kill Ralph over the horse. He killed him because he couldn't stand the mirror. Revisiting the fiery demise of Pyomai and the tension that ignited it, the question arises, did Ralphie Cifaretto torch the stables in a fit of passive-aggressive revenge after learning Tony Soprano was dating Valentina? The answer? No, not exactly. But that doesn't make the scenario any less revealing of the tangled egos and hypocrisies that define the Sopranos. Ralphie didn't light the match out of romantic vengeance. Let's not flatter his emotional capacity. While he did have a soft spot for Valentina, at least in the way narcissists occasionally attach themselves to shiny objects, it's absurd to imagine him setting a fire over wounded love. He didn't burn the horse because Tony took his girl. He burned the horse because he's an opportunistic sociopath, and the insurance money was more appealing than a living, breathing animal. After all, in his own charming words, it's just a fucking horse. The irony, of course, is that Tony, perpetual avatar of righteous hypocrisy, finds this particular moral line worth drawing. Tony, who beat Zellman with a belt for the crime of dating his discarded mistress Irina, now plays protector of Pyomai, as though animal cruelty is where he finally finds his soul. That beating led to Zellman losing Irina because, naturally, nothing emasculates quite like getting publicly whipped by your girlfriend's mobbed-up ex. Irina, ever the loyal mess, circled back to Tony emotionally, culminating in that disastrous call to Carmela and the domestic implosion of Whitecaps. Tony's unresolved emotional trail of destruction, as always, loops back to haunt everyone but him, until it does. Ralph's destruction of the horse, if he even ordered it directly, was hardly personal. It was profitable. Like most characters in The Sopranos, Ralph operated with a terminal case of self-interest. A dead racehorse meant insurance. End of story. It's not that he couldn't have used it as a jab at Tony. It's just that he didn't need to. The money was reason enough. And if that fuck you element was layered in as a bonus, well, Ralph's not one to pass on a 2-for-1 deal. Still, the timing of the fire, so soon after Tony's smug revelation that he's taken up with Valentina, cannot be ignored. Ralph's reaction is telling, restrained, emotionally concealed, but strategically barbed. His remark to Tony, dragging Carmela into the mess, "You're cheating on her again, after all she's done for you?" is less about morality and more about twisting the knife on his way out. It's calculated, not heartfelt. And then, boom, fire. Coincidence? Possibly. Ralph's entire arc is a slow-motion car crash of increasingly grotesque behavior catching up with him. It's just as plausible the stable fire was an accident, faulty wiring, negligence, whatever, as it is a targeted hit. But that doesn't matter to Tony, who is always looking for an external object onto which he can project his guilt. Just ask cousin Tony Blundetto. When guilt becomes unbearable, someone has to pay. And Ralph, whose every breath seems to offend Tony's fragile, selective sense of honor, made for a perfect scapegoat. If Ralph had truly torched the horse, would he have denied it so vigorously? Possibly not. He's hardly known for subtlety or shame. He's boasted about far worse. But this isn't about Ralph's honesty. It's about Tony's need for moral superiority, no matter how unearned. Ralph became a target because he made Tony feel things. Shame, anger, loss, affection for an animal Tony barely acknowledged until it reflected his own need to feel noble. In the end, Ralph's downfall was less about the horse and more about the mirror he held up. The Sopranos never needed villains and heroes, just people with ugly motives dressed up in misplaced justifications. Ralph didn't kill the horse out of spite, but it's telling that everyone, including Tony, was ready to believe he did.